Picture this, it's 1790, and the first president of the United States is standing in front of a mirror, carefully inserting his dentures. But here's the thing, they're not wooden. They're made from hippopotamus ivory, human teeth, and metal springs so strong they push his lips outward, giving him that stern expression we see in every portrait. The springs were so powerful that Washington had to consciously clench his jaw to keep his mouth closed. Imagine giving a speech while fighting against metal coils trying to force your mouth open. George Washington was in constant, grinding pain, and it shaped not just his face, but his famously controlled demeanor. We think we know George Washington, the father of our country. The man who couldn't tell a lie about chopping down a cherry tree, a story that's completely fabricated, by the way, invented by a biographer after Washington's death. The guy on the dollar bill with that serious, marble statue expression. But strip away the mythology, the hero worship, the generations of American civic religion, and you find someone far more interesting, a man who was vain about his appearance, temperamental to the point of rage, surprisingly socially awkward, obsessed with his reputation, and yet somehow became the person who held a fragile new nation together through sheer force of character and willpower. Today, we're diving deep into who George Washington really was as a person. Not the marble statue. Not the myth. But the flesh and blood human being with insecurities, contradictions, passions, and flaws. Because the real Washington is actually a lot more interesting than the legend. Let's start with young George, because he was nothing like the dignified elder statesman we imagine. Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into what we might call the middle tier of Virginia's plantation society. His family owned land and slaves, yes, but they weren't the Lees, the Randolphs, or the Carters, the great aristocratic families of Virginia. They were just okay. Comfortable but not wealthy. Respected but not powerful, and young George Washington absolutely hated being just okay. His father Augustine died when George was only 11 years old, and this derailed everything. His older half-brothers had been sent to England for their education. The path to becoming a proper gentleman. But with Augustine dead and the family finances strained, there was no money to send George abroad. No prestigious English school. No grand tour of Europe. No connections with British nobility. This haunted Washington his entire life. He ended up with maybe 8 years of formal schooling total, essentially the 18th century equivalent of dropping out in middle school. While his social betters quoted Latin and Greek, discussed philosophy, and moved comfortably in elite circles, Washington was painfully aware that he lacked the educational polish that marked true gentlemen. He was deeply, deeply insecure about this, and he spent the rest of his life trying to compensate for it. When Washington was about 14 or 16, the exact date is unclear, he hand-copied 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation into a notebook. These rules were originally compiled by French Jesuits in the 16th century and were circulating in English translation as a guide for young people learning proper manners. Now, copying these rules was a common school exercise, so there's nothing unusual about that. But what's revealing is what Washington chose to copy and how seriously he took them. These weren't just random table manners to him, they were a blueprint for how to act around his social betters, a desperately needed guide to a world he hadn't been born quite high enough to navigate naturally. Some of the rules are about basic etiquette: sleep not when others speak, kill no vermin as fleas, lice, ticks in the sight of others, don't puff up your cheeks, loll not out your tongue, rub your hands together. Pretty basic stuff about not being gross, but others cut deeper, revealing what young Washington thought he needed to learn. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. In speaking to men of quality, do not lean nor look them full in the face. Let your countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters somewhat grave. Be not hasty to believe flying reports to the disparagement of any, and this one, which might be the most telling, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. This tells us something crucial about Washington. He wasn't naturally dignified, composed, or controlled. Those qualities we associate with him? He worked obsessively, methodically, painstakingly to build them. He taught himself how to be George Washington. Here's what helped him stand out, though: his physical presence. Washington was somewhere between 6'2" and 6'3.5" tall, depending on which contemporary account you believe. In an era when the average man was about 5'7", he was towering. He was broad-shouldered, athletic, and extraordinarily strong. Thomas Jefferson, who served in Washington's cabinet and knew him well, said Washington was the best horseman of his age, and the most graceful figure that could be seen on horseback. Multiple people commented on his extraordinary physical coordination and strength. There are stories of him throwing a stone across the Rappahannock River, which sounds like mythology, but enough people mentioned his strength that it was clearly remarkable. He had reddish-brown hair that he powdered white for formal occasions, gray-blue eyes, and a complexion that multiple people described as weathered from years of outdoor work and military campaigns. And yes, even in his 20s, he started having terrible problems with his teeth. By his 40s, he was losing teeth regularly. By the time he became president, he had perhaps one natural tooth left. Washington was acutely aware that his physical presence was one of his greatest assets, and he used it deliberately. He dressed impeccably, often beyond his means, in the finest clothes he could commission. He sat a horse beautifully. He moved with deliberate dignity. When he walked into a room, people noticed, but this wasn't natural aristocratic ease, it was carefully cultivated performance, the product of endless self-conscious effort by someone who knew he needed every advantage he could manufacture. At age 21, Washington managed to get himself appointed as a major in the Virginia militia, despite having exactly zero military experience. How? Through connections, specifically his half-brother Lawrence's relationship with the powerful Fairfax family, and through sheer force of wanting it badly enough. Washington desperately wanted military glory. He wanted honor, recognition, and most of all, he wanted respect. He wanted to be seen as important. In 1753, Virginia's governor sent him into the Ohio wilderness to deliver a message to French forces, demanding they leave territory Virginia claimed. It was a dangerous mission through hundreds of miles of wilderness in winter, and Washington seized it as his chance to prove himself. He nearly died several times, shot at, almost drowned, nearly froze, but he made it there and back. His published journal of the expedition made him, at 21, briefly famous in the colonies and even in London. He loved it. Finally, recognition. The next year, 1754, he led an expedition back into the Ohio Territory, and this is where things went badly wrong. Washington led his men into an ambush at a place called Jumonville Glen. In the confused fighting, a French diplomat named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville was killed, possibly murdered after surrendering. Sources disagree. Washington then retreated to a hastily built fortification he named, optimistically, Fort Necessity. The French surrounded him, and Washington was forced to surrender. He signed surrender documents that were in French, which he couldn't read properly. Those documents included a statement that he had assassinated Jumonville. This sparked a diplomatic crisis that helped trigger the French and Indian War, which then helped trigger the 7 Years' War, one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century. Washington, at 22, had accidentally helped start a world war. Was he humiliated? Absolutely. His military reputation was in tatters, yet his persistence helped him push forward. Here's something the mythology consistently leaves out: George Washington had a volcanic, explosive temper. This isn't speculation, it's documented by people who worked closely with him for years, Alexander Hamilton, who served as his aide-de-camp during the Revolution and knew him as well as almost anyone, described Washington as having violent passions. Thomas Jefferson wrote that Washington's temper was the naturally irritable and high-toned. Multiple aides, generals, and colleagues recorded instances of Washington losing his composure completely. When Washington lost his temper, and this happened regularly, his face would flush deep red, his body would shake, his voice would rise to a roar. And he would unleash withering torrents of fury on whoever was nearby. During the Revolutionary War, he once threw his hat on the ground and screamed at General Charles Lee, calling him a damned poltroon, which in 18th century language means roughly "you absolute coward." At the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, Washington arrived to find Lee retreating in confusion. Witnesses said Washington swore at Lee with a stream of profanity so intense that everyone was shocked. Remember, this was a formal, religious era where gentlemen didn't curse casually. One officer said Washington swore till the leaves shook on the trees. There are stories of him snapping riding crops, throwing papers, dismissing aides with brutal coldness when they disappointed him. His anger was legendary among those who worked with him, but here's what made Washington remarkable, what transformed him from just another temperamental military leader into something more. He knew this about himself and fought constantly to control it. Those rules of civility he'd copied as a teenager? That famous composure and dignity everyone remarked on. It was all a lid he was forcing down, through continuous exhausting effort, on a boiling pot. The self-control wasn't his natural state, it was an act of will he had to perform constantly, every day, often failing but always trying again. This makes his achievement more impressive, not less. Washington became great not because it was easy for him, but because he worked so hard at it. Washington was also remarkably sensitive to criticism. When Congress questioned his military strategy during the Revolution, when newspapers criticized his decisions, when anyone implied he wasn't doing a good job, he took it intensely personally. He wrote wounded, defensive letters to Congress explaining his decisions in elaborate detail. He wrote to friends complaining about the lack of appreciation for his sacrifices. He threatened to resign multiple times, though notably, he never actually did. The threats were real expressions of hurt feelings, not manipulative tactics. In 1777, there was a movement in Congress to replace Washington with General Horatio Gates, who had just won a major victory at Saratoga. Washington got wind of this Conway cabal as it became known, and he was devastated. He saw it as a betrayal, an attack on his honor. He wrote letters dripping with wounded pride and barely contained anger. Martha Washington later said that her husband was not in his element unless he was in command and being shown proper respect. He needed deference. He needed to be in charge. And he struggled emotionally when he didn't get the recognition he felt he'd earned. This wasn't petty ego exactly, or not only that. Washington had genuinely sacrificed years of his life, his health, his finances, and his peace of mind for the Revolution. When people didn't seem to appreciate that, it hurt. Washington learned, probably through painful experience, that familiarity breeds contempt. So he deliberately kept his distance from his soldiers, from Congress, from diplomats, from almost everyone except a very tight inner circle. He was formal, reserved, dignified to the point of stiffness with most people. He controlled his accessibility carefully. He didn't drink and joke with his officers the way some other generals did. He didn't slap backs or use first names casually. He maintained what one historian called the dignity of distance. This wasn't coldness exactly, and it wasn't shyness. Washington could be warm when he chose to be. It was strategy. He understood intuitively that mystique was power. That the leader of a revolutionary army and later the first president couldn't be just one of the guys. He had to be something more, something special, something almost mythic. It must have been lonely. But it worked. There's a moment that captures Washington's personality perfectly. In 1783, after the Treaty of Paris officially ended the Revolutionary War, Washington wrote a circular letter to the state governors. This was his moment of triumph. He'd won the impossible war, created a nation, secured his place in history, and what did he write? A letter full of anxiety about the future, warnings about the fragility of the new nation, and pleas for unity. Even in victory, Washington couldn't relax. He was already worrying about what came next, already seeing the threats to everything they'd built. That was Washington, never content, never satisfied, always seeing the next crisis, always feeling the weight of responsibility. Here's a detail that humanizes Washington wonderfully. He apparently was not a good dancer at all, but he loved dancing. He attended balls constantly, both before and after his marriage to Martha. He would dance for hours at social events. Multiple contemporaries describe him as enthusiastic but stiff, formal in his movements, not particularly graceful despite his general athletic ability. There's something genuinely endearing about this. Washington knew he wasn't a good dancer, but he loved doing it anyway and didn't let his lack of skill stop him. The man who was so controlled and conscious of his dignity in every other area just really wanted to dance, even if he looked awkward doing it. Washington wrote letters constantly. Over his lifetime, he wrote or dictated more than 18,000 letters. And if you read them, you find someone far more emotional, uncertain, and human than the portraits suggest. In his 20s, Washington wrote passionate, longing letters to Sally Fairfax, the wife of his best friend and neighbor George William Fairfax. The exact nature of their relationship is debated by historians, but Washington's feelings were clearly intense. In one letter from 1758, he wrote to her, "You have drawn me, dear madam, or rather I have drawn myself, into an honest confession of a simple fact. Misconstrue not my meaning, doubt it not, nor expose it. The world has no business to know the object of my love." He may have been in love with Sally Fairfax his entire life. Even after his marriage to Martha, he kept Sally's letters, and late in life he wrote to her again, reminiscing about those happy moments, the happiest of my life, which I have enjoyed in your company. During the Revolution, Washington wrote anxious letters to his brother, to trusted friends, expressing his fears that he would fail, that he wasn't equal to the task, that history would judge him harshly. In 1775, just after accepting command of the Continental Army, he wrote, "I have been called upon by the unanimous voice of the colonies to take command of the Continental Army. I am embarked on a wide ocean, boundless in its prospect, and from whence, perhaps, no safe harbor is to be found." He wasn't pretending to be confident. He was genuinely terrified. Washington also wrote hurt, emotional letters when he felt unappreciated or betrayed. When Congress failed to provide supplies for his army, when state governments didn't send troops, when he felt his officers or subordinates had let him down, he wrote letters full of disappointment, frustration, and wounded feelings. The man had deep emotions, and he poured them onto paper in ways he couldn't express in person. Washington never had biological children, most likely due to an illness in his youth, possibly malaria or smallpox, that may have left him sterile. This bothered him. In 18th-century Virginia society, a man's legacy was carried through his children, and Washington was acutely aware that he would have no direct descendants. But when he married the wealthy widow Martha Custis in 1759, he became stepfather to her two young children, 4-year-old Jackie and 2-year-old Patsy. And Washington threw himself into being a father with unexpected warmth and devotion. He worried about their health constantly. He carefully managed their finances and estates. He was indulgent, perhaps too indulgent, especially with Jackie, who grew up to be a somewhat lazy young man more interested in parties than work. Washington kept trying to get Jackie to take education seriously, to apply himself, to live up to his potential, with limited success. When Patsy developed epilepsy and died in 1773 at age 17, Washington was devastated. Martha was so destroyed by grief that she couldn't handle the funeral arrangements, Washington did everything. When Jackie died of camp fever, probably typhus, in 1781 during the Revolution, having served briefly as Washington's aide, Washington was again genuinely shattered. He and Martha legally adopted 2 of Jackie's children to raise. With family, especially with children, Washington's emotional walls came down. He could be warm, affectionate, playful even. It was perhaps the only area of his life where he didn't feel he had to perform dignity every moment. What Washington really wanted to be, what he told people over and over, was a gentleman farmer at Mount Vernon. Not a general. Not a president. Definitely not a politician. He wanted to manage his plantation, experiment with different crops and farming techniques, breed mules. He was weirdly obsessed with breeding the perfect mules, host dinners for guests, improve his properties, and live the life of a Virginia country gentleman. Mount Vernon was his refuge, his sanctuary, the place he felt most himself. He expanded the house multiple times, designed the grounds, oversaw every detail of its operation. When he was there, he rode around the plantation every day inspecting everything personally. Every single time he left Mount Vernon for public service, to lead the Continental Army, to attend the Constitutional Convention, to serve as president, he wrote like he was being torn away from paradise. He genuinely did not want these positions. He felt duty demanded them, and Washington always answered the call of duty, but he resented it. In 1783, after resigning his military commission, he wrote, "I am retiring within myself. I am not only retiring from all public employments, but I am retiring within myself." He got 6 years at home. Then the Constitution needed writing, and people wanted him at the convention. Then the nation needed a president, and everyone wanted him. He served 2 terms as president, established the office, set crucial precedents, and the moment he could legitimately leave, he did. He went home to Mount Vernon and never left Virginia again. He got less than 3 years there before he died. One more detail that reveals Washington's personality: he kept meticulous records of everything. Financial accounts down to the penny. Weather observations. Details of every crop planted and harvested. Lists of visitors. He recorded daily temperatures for years. He made notes on the performance of individual slaves, more on that in a moment, because we can't skip past it. This obsessive documentation reveals someone who craved control and order, who tried to manage and systematize every aspect of his world. It also reveals someone deeply anxious. You don't keep that level of detail unless you're worried about losing track, about things slipping out of your control. We have to talk about this honestly. George Washington enslaved human beings. More than 300 people were enslaved at Mount Vernon over his lifetime, some owned by Washington, some controlled by him through Martha's property. He bought and sold people. He pursued escapees relentlessly. There's a particularly disturbing story about Ona Judge, one of Martha's personal slaves, who escaped in 1796 while Washington was president. Washington tried for years to get her back, including attempting to use federal authority to capture her, even though she'd made it to New Hampshire, a free state. When Ona Judge was interviewed late in her life, she said she'd run away because she heard Martha was planning to give her as a wedding gift to Martha's granddaughter. And Ona wanted to be free. Washington's relationship with slavery was complicated and deeply contradictory. In private letters, especially later in life, he expressed discomfort with the institution. He called it repugnant and said he wished for some plan to abolish it. He was apparently bothered by the obvious moral contradiction between the Revolution's ideals and the reality of slavery. But here's the thing: he didn't do anything about it while it mattered. He didn't free his slaves. He didn't speak publicly against slavery. He didn't use his enormous moral authority to push for abolition or even gradual emancipation. What he did was include a provision in his will that his slaves, not Martha's, which he legally couldn't free, would be freed after both he and Martha died. Martha freed them a year after his death, apparently uncomfortable with the implication that enslaved people might have motivation to see her die, so Washington becomes the only major founding father who freed his slaves, even with conditions. But he only did it when it no longer cost him anything, when he was dead and beyond earthly consequences. Some historians argue this shows moral growth, that Washington came to see slavery as wrong even if he couldn't bring himself to act decisively against it. Others argue it's a perfect example of how someone can intellectually acknowledge evil while continuing to benefit from it, salving their conscience with private doubts while doing nothing to change the system. Both things can be true. Washington was morally compromised on slavery in ways that we cannot and should not excuse. And he was also, perhaps, slightly ahead of most of his peers in at least acknowledging the moral problem, even if he failed to truly confront it. This contradiction between ideals and actions, between knowledge and courage, doesn't erase Washington's achievements, but it means we can't understand who he was as a person without grappling with this fundamental moral failure. When Washington became president in 1789, he was acutely, almost painfully aware that everything he did would set precedents for future presidents. There was no handbook. No established traditions. Just a constitution that left enormous details undefined. How should people address the president? Washington and Congress debated this seriously. Some wanted titles like His High Mightiness or His Excellency. Washington ended up going with the simple Mr. President, establishing that American leaders wouldn't use royal-style titles should the president socialize freely with citizens or maintain dignified distance. Washington tried to strike a balance, holding formal receptions but also limiting his accessibility. He didn't want to seem like a king but also knew the office needed respect. How long should a president serve? The Constitution didn't say. Washington could have stayed in office as long as he lived, and many people wanted him to. But after 2 terms, he voluntarily stepped down, establishing a tradition that held until FDR and that was later encoded in the 22nd Amendment. This might be Washington's greatest achievement. He voluntarily gave up power. In an era when people typically held power until they died, when most revolutions ended with the revolutionary leader becoming a new dictator, Washington walked away. Twice, first after the Revolution, then after the presidency, King George III. When told Washington planned to resign his military commission and return to his farm, reportedly said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Washington did it. Not because it was easy, but because he believed the Republic required it. One thing that genuinely distressed Washington in his later years was the rise of political parties. He hated partisan division. He saw it as faction that would tear the nation apart, and he watched in dismay as his own cabinet split between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Washington tried to stay above the fray, to be a president for all Americans, but by his second term he was being attacked viciously in partisan newspapers. People who had praised him for decades were now calling him a would-be king, a tool of aristocrats, out of touch with common people. This hurt Washington deeply. He'd sacrificed years of his life for the country, and now people were treating him like a political enemy. His farewell address, published in 1796, was partly a warning against the dangers of political parties and excessive partisanship. He was watching the nation he'd fought to create already fracturing along political lines, and it broke his heart. He felt like he'd failed to preserve unity. Washington finally got to retire to Mount Vernon in March 1797, and he threw himself back into farming. He was happier than he'd been in years. On December 12, 1799, he spent 5 hours riding around his properties in freezing rain and snow, inspecting farms, checking on work. He came home with snow in his hair but refused to change clothes before dinner. He didn't want to keep his guests waiting, and besides, he was tough. A little cold and wet wouldn't hurt him. The next day he woke up with a sore throat that rapidly worsened. By December 14, he was struggling to breathe. Doctors were called and applied the standard medical treatment of the era, bloodletting. They drained about 40% of his blood over less than a day, which almost certainly killed him faster than the throat infection would have. Washington, even dying, tried to remain stoic and controlled. He apologized to his doctors for the trouble he was causing. He gave instructions for his burial. He checked his own pulse as it weakened. His last words were reportedly, "'Tis well." Even in death, composed and controlled, the performance held to the very end. He was 67 years old. Martha burned their correspondence after his death, so we'll never know what their most private letters said to each other. So who was George Washington, really? He was vain and insecure about his lack of formal education, spending his life trying to prove he belonged among Virginia's elite. He was ambitious to the point of desperation, craving recognition and respect. He had a volcanic temper that he fought constantly to control, with mixed success. He was thin-skinned about criticism, sensitive about his reputation, and hurt easily by perceived slights. He was also surprisingly awkward in some ways, a bad dancer who loved dancing anyway, someone who had to learn social graces from a rulebook rather than absorbing them naturally. He was far more emotional than his public image suggests, pouring feelings into letters that he couldn't express in person. He was capable of great warmth with his family but maintained cool distance with almost everyone else, strategically cultivating mystique and dignity because he understood they were necessary for leadership. He was a devoted stepfather, a man who loved his plantation and his home, who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to farm in peace. He was also someone who enslaved hundreds of people while speaking vaguely about liberty, who recognized slavery was wrong but lacked the courage to act against it during his lifetime. This moral failure is inseparable from who he was, and we diminish both him and history if we ignore it or explain it away. But Washington was also someone with extraordinary character. Not because virtue came easily to him, but because he worked at it relentlessly. He wasn't naturally dignified, he taught himself dignity. He wasn't naturally controlled, he imposed control through constant, exhausting effort. He wasn't naturally selfless, he chose duty over desire, over and over, for decades. Washington became great through sheer, stubborn persistence. He decided what kind of man the moment required, and then he worked obsessively to become that man, even when it meant wrestling with his own worst impulses, his own deepest wants, every single day. The marble statue was born perfect and unchanging. The real George Washington was flawed, difficult, contradictory, sometimes petty, often uncomfortable in his own skin. But he was also someone who somehow summoned the character to lead an army that shouldn't have won, to unite colonies that didn't trust each other, to establish a republic in a world of monarchies, and to voluntarily give up power not once but twice in an era when nobody did that. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't the man who couldn't tell a lie, he couldn't did when it served him, though he tried to be honest in important matters. He wasn't even particularly likable, most people found him intimidating and remote, but he was a human being who decided what kind of person he needed to be and then became that person through sheer force of will, discipline, and continuous self-creation. He spent his entire life performing the role of George Washington, and the performance was so consistent, so disciplined, that it became real. That's the actual George Washington. And honestly, that complicated, striving, deeply human figure is far more interesting, far more inspiring than any myth we've built around him, because myths are for people who were born great. Washington had to make himself great. And maybe that's a better story.